Asha Wilson was a name that carried weight in her community. A former elite special forces operative, she had spent years training in high-pressure environments, mastering tactics that had saved countless lives. Now, however, she led a quieter life, dedicating herself to a different kind of mission. Asha had left the service to focus on her family and to share her knowledge of self-defense with women and young people in marginalized communities. She believed deeply in empowerment through preparation and skill lessons she was determined to pass down to her two children, Kai, 16, and Layla, 14. This particular Saturday, the three of them ventured out to an old industrial district on the outskirts of their city. It was a quiet area, long abandoned by factories and businesses, making it an ideal place for her to conduct their weekly self-defense training without drawing attention. Asha always chose her training grounds carefully, preferring places where her children could focus without distractions, where they could push their limits without fear of judgment. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt and rusted remnants of machinery. The air was thick with the smell of grease and dust, and the occasional cry of a bird echoed off the crumbling walls of the nearby warehouses. Asha had set up a makeshift training area in one of the larger empty lots, using old wooden pallets as obstacles and a series of cones to mark movement drills. She stood tall, her posture commanding yet calm, as she instructed her children. "Remember," Asha said, her voice steady and strong, "self-defense isn't about looking for a fight. It's about surviving one. The moment you hesitate, the moment you lose focus, that's when things can spiral out of control. Always stay aware." Kai, her eldest, nodded with determination. He was lean and athletic, with sharp reflexes and a keen understanding of the techniques his mother taught. Layla, smaller and less physically imposing, made up for her size with speed and precision. She had a natural grace to her movements, and Asha often marveled at how quickly her daughter absorbed lessons. Today's session was focused on situational awareness and close-quarters defense. Kai played the role of the aggressor, using padded training gloves as he moved in to simulate an attack on Layla. Layla's task was to stay calm, deflect his movements, and use her agility to escape his reach. Asha watched closely, offering corrections and encouragement. "Good, Layla. Keep your center of gravity low. Kai, don't telegraph your moves. If she can see your intention, she'll outmaneuver you every time." Layla sidestepped one of Kai's advances and countered with a swift motion, her small frame evading his grasp with ease. Asha allowed herself a small smile, pride swelling in her chest. They were learning. They were becoming stronger. Unbeknownst to them, Officer Derek Mills was patrolling the area in his squad car. Mills was a mid-level officer with a decade on the force, but his reputation was far from stellar. He had a history of abrasive behavior, especially toward minorities, and his colleagues often whispered about his temper and unspoken biases. Today he wasn't officially on duty, he was using his shift to handle a side hustle, collecting money from local vendors who relied on him for protection from fabricated threats. As Mills cruised through the industrial district, he heard faint sounds of movement and muffled voices. His curiosity piqued. He parked his car and stepped out, scanning the area. His sharp eyes caught sight of Asha and her children in the distance, their movements deliberate and focused. To Mills, the sight of a black woman leading what appeared to be a training session for teenagers immediately raised suspicions. His mind leapt to conclusions, fueled by prejudice and arrogance. "What are they up to?" Mills muttered to himself, adjusting his belt. Training for something illegal, no doubt. Mills approached the group without announcing himself, his boots crunching on the gravel. When Asha noticed him, her instincts kicked in immediately. She gestured for her children to pause and straightened, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the officer. Mills was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. His uniform was slightly disheveled, and his hand rested on the butt of his holstered weapon, a gesture that Asher recognized as a deliberate show of dominance. "Evening," Mills called out, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" Asher remained composed, her voice calm but firm. "We're training. Is there a problem, officer?" Mills squinted at her, his eyes flicking between Kai and Layla, who stood silently behind their mother. "Training for what exactly? You got a permit to be out here doing whatever this is?" Asher tilted her head slightly, unbothered by his attempt to intimidate her. "We're on public property. Just teaching my kids a few self-defense techniques. Nothing illegal about that." Mills snorted, crossing his arms. "Self-defense, ha! Seems more like you're teaching them how to cause trouble. Kids their age don't need to know how to fight. They need discipline, not whatever this is." Kai clenched his fists at the insult, but Asher held up a hand, silently signaling him to stay calm. She met Mills' gaze, refusing to back down. "With all due respect, officer, self-defense is discipline. It's about responsibility and awareness, not aggression." Mills took a step closer, his tone hardening. "Look, lady, I don't care what your intentions are. This looks suspicious and I don't like it. You're out here teaching your kids to act like thugs, and that's a problem." Asher's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "If you're here to address a crime, officer, then say so. If not, I'd appreciate it if you let us finish our session in peace." The tension between them was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken hostility. Mills was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. His hand hovered near his belt, his fingers twitching. "You've got a smart mouth," he said coldly. "Maybe too smart for your own good." Kai and Layla exchanged uneasy glances, their mother's earlier lessons echoing in their minds. Stay calm. Stay focused. Don't provoke, but don't submit. Mills' posture grew more aggressive, and Asher could sense that he was looking for an excuse to escalate. But before he could make his next move, Kai spoke up, his voice steady but sharp. "Is there something you need from us, officer? Or are you just here to harass us?" Mills' eyes snapped to Kai, his expression darkening. "Watch your tone, kid. You don't want to make this worse." Asher stepped between them, her voice cutting through the tension like steel. "That's enough. We're done here." But Mills wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Mills wasn't done. He took another step closer, his presence looming over Asher and her children. The sun cast harsh shadows on his face, accentuating the disdain in his eyes. To him, this wasn't just about an odd training session. It was an opportunity to assert authority and put someone in their place. His voice cut through the tense air with a sharp edge. "You think you're smart, don't you? Out here playing drill sergeant with your kids. I know what this is. You're teaching them to resist law enforcement, aren't you?" he accused, his tone dripping with contempt. Asher's composure didn't falter, though she felt the surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had dealt with men like Mills before, bullies in positions of power who thrived on intimidation. Her years of military training had taught her to stay calm in moments like this. Reacting emotionally would only escalate the situation. "I'm teaching my children how to defend themselves in a dangerous world, officer," she replied, her voice measured. "If that's a problem, I'd like to know what law we're breaking." Mills' face darkened further, his frustration mounting as his attempts to unnerve her fell flat. He turned his gaze to Kai and Layla, his lips curling into a sneer. "And what about them? Are they going to defend themselves against me? Is that the plan here? Because if it is, let me make one thing clear: they won't stand a chance." Kai's hands tightened into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. Layla shifted uneasily, her eyes flicking to her mother for reassurance. Asha glanced at her son, giving him the faintest shake of her head, a silent reminder to stay in control. She stepped forward, positioning herself squarely between her children and the officer. "With all due respect, officer, you're overstepping," Asha said firmly. "We're not looking for trouble. We're just here to train. If you have a legitimate concern, state it. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd let us go about our business." Mills laughed a short, humorless bark. "Let you go about your business?" he repeated mockingly. "Your business looks a lot like trouble to me. You think you can just say a few big words and I'll walk away? That's not how this works, lady." He reached for his belt and unhooked his radio, his thumb hovering over the button. "Maybe we need some backup here," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'm starting to think this is more than just a harmless workout." "Backup?" Asha asked, her tone remaining even despite the tension tightening around them. "For what? We're unarmed. We're on public property. What exactly are you accusing us of, officer?" Mills didn't answer immediately. Instead, he fixed her with a hard stare, as though trying to will her into submission. When that didn't work, he took another step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, until he was uncomfortably close to her. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to pack up your little training session and get out of here. And if you give me any more lip, I'll find a reason to take you all in. You got that?" Asha's mind worked quickly, analyzing the situation. She knew the type of man she was dealing with, someone who thrived on power and control, someone who saw her refusal to back down as a challenge. If she pushed too hard, he would escalate. If she showed weakness, he would exploit it. It was a delicate balance. "Officer," she said, keeping her voice steady, "we're not going anywhere. We have every right to be here. If you're accusing us of something, be specific. Otherwise, I suggest you stand down." Mill's hand drifted toward his holster, his fingers brushing the grip of his firearm. The subtle movement didn't go unnoticed by Asha or her children. Layla inhaled sharply, and Kai took a half step forward, but Asha held out her arm, stopping him. "Mom," Kai murmured, his voice tight with restrained anger. "He's trying to provoke us." "I know," Asha said softly, without breaking eye contact with Mills. "And we're not going to give him what he wants." Mills smirked, clearly enjoying the tension he was creating. He was about to speak again when Kai's gaze flickered toward the patrol car parked nearby. Something caught his eye, a bundle of papers sitting on the dashboard, partially obscured by the glare of the sun. He couldn't make out the details, but the words "cash logs" were scrawled in bold letters across the top. Next to it was an unmarked envelope, its contents slightly spilling out. The edges of $100 bills peeked through. "Mum," Kai said quietly, leaning toward her, "look at the car." The dashboard. Asha's eyes darted to the patrol car for a brief moment before returning to Mills. Her mind processed the information quickly. The cash logs, the envelope, the overly defensive behavior. Mills wasn't just here by chance. He was likely involved in something far more dubious than hassling a family in an empty lot. "Officer," Asha said, shifting her stance slightly, "it seems like you're more interested in intimidating us than enforcing the law. Should I be concerned about why you're really here?" Mill's smirk disappeared, replaced by a flash of anger. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You don't get to ask me questions. I'm the one in charge here. Are you?" Asha shot back, her tone still calm but now laced with steel. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're more interested in covering something up than doing your job." Mill's face flushed red, and he took another aggressive step forward. "That's it," he snapped. "You want to play smart. Let's see how smart you are down at the station. Turn around. Now. Layla's breath hitched, and Kai's fists clenched tighter. But Asha remained unmoved, her expression as steady as her voice. You're making a mistake, she said, locking eyes with Mills. You have no grounds to detain us. I don't need grounds, Mills snarled, reaching for Asha's arm. You're coming with me. As his hand closed around her wrist, Asha reacted instinctively. In one fluid motion, she twisted out of his grip and stepped back, her body poised and ready. Don't touch me, she said, her voice firm and commanding. Mills froze for a moment, startled by her swift and precise movements. His gaze flickered between her and the children, as if realizing for the first time that he might be outmatched. You don't want to do this, Asha warned, her tone low and measured. Step away now. But Mills wasn't backing down. His hand moved toward his radio again, and his other hand hovered near his holster. The situation was teetering on the edge of chaos, and Asha knew it. She glanced at Kai and Layla, giving them a subtle nod, a signal they had practiced countless times before. The storm was about to break. The moment hung in the air like a thunderstorm ready to break. Asha's body was tense, her instincts sharp, as she watched Mills reach for his holster. Her children stood behind her, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. They had trained for situations like this, but nothing could fully prepare them for the reality of a confrontation with an armed and hostile police officer. Step back, Mills barked, his voice rising in frustration. I gave you a lawful order. Don't make me use force. Asha didn't flinch. Her gaze locked onto Mills, her voice calm but commanding. You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to go any further. We've done nothing wrong, and you know it. Put your hand away and walk back to your car, officer. Mills' face flushed red with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a woman. The fact that she wasn't intimidated by him only fueled his need to assert control. To him, this wasn't just about enforcing authority, it was personal. He saw her defiance as a threat to his ego, a challenge he couldn't ignore. Defiant, aren't you? Mills sneered. You think you can just talk your way out of this? You think you're above the law? Kai's fists clenched tightly at his sides. His mother's calm demeanor was the only thing keeping him from stepping forward, but his anger was building. Layla, standing beside him, placed a hand on his arm, a silent reminder to stay steady, just like their mother had taught them. Mom, Kai said quietly, his voice strained. This guy's not going to back off. I know, Asha replied without turning her head. But we're not going to give him an excuse. The tension escalated further when Mills suddenly stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Asha. His hand was still dangerously close to his weapon, and his eyes burned with barely restrained hostility. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, he snapped. I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction. Obstruction of what? Asha asked, her voice sharp now. You have no grounds, no evidence, and no justification. This is harassment, plain and simple. Don't you lecture me about the law. Mills roared, his composure slipping. He reached out, grabbing for her arm again, but this time Asha was ready. In one fluid motion, Asha sidestepped his grasp, using his momentum against him. She twisted his wrist just enough to make him release his grip, and took a step back, putting more space between them. Don't touch me again, she said firmly, her voice steady but with an edge of steel. This is your last warning. Mills stumbled, caught off guard by her quick reflexes. His expression darkened further, now a mix of humiliation and rage. He straightened, his hand going fully to his holster this time. You've just assaulted an officer, he spat. That's it. You're all coming with me. Before he could draw his weapon, Kai stepped forward, unable to hold back any longer. His voice was loud and forceful. "Leave her alone." Mill's eyes snapped to Kai, his face twisting with anger. "Stay out of this, kid. Unless you want to spend the night in a cell too." "Kai, no," Asha said sharply, her tone carrying a clear warning. She turned her attention back to Mills. "You're out of control. My son has nothing to do with this. If you escalate further, you'll be the one breaking the law." But Mills wasn't listening. He was too far gone, his pride wounded and his temper flaring. He took another step forward, his hand now fully gripping the handle of his gun. The situation had reached a breaking point, and Asha knew she had to act. Her voice dropped low, steady and commanding. "Children, fall back. Now." Kai and Layla hesitated for only a moment before obeying, stepping back several paces. Asha shifted her stance, her years of training kicking in as she prepared for the worst. "Last chance, officer," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Stand down, or you'll regret this." Mills sneered, mistaking her confidence for a bluff. "Oh, I'll regret this. That's rich. Let's see how tough you really are." He took another aggressive step forward, his body tense. But before he could make another move, Asha struck. Using his momentum against him once again, she stepped in close, grabbed his wrist, and twisted it sharply. The gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground. Mills let out a shout of pain. But Asha didn't stop. She used her other hand to shove him backward, sending him stumbling and off balance. Before he could recover, she kicked the gun farther away, ensuring it was out of his reach. Kai and Layla watched in stunned silence, their mother's precision and control leaving them in awe. Mills, on the other hand, was furious. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You're going to pay for that," he hissed, reaching for his radio. "Backup's on the way, and when they get here, you're done." "Go ahead," Asha replied coolly. "Call your backup. But when they see the footage from your dashcam and find out what you've been doing out here, let's see who's really done." Mills froze for a moment, the realization sinking in. His patrol car's dashcam was likely still recording, and Asha's words struck a nerve. He knew he was in over his head, but his arrogance wouldn't let him back down. "You think you're so smart," he muttered, his voice low. "But you don't know who you're dealing with. And neither do you," Asha shot back. "You think your badge makes you untouchable. It doesn't. I've dealt with men like you before. Bullies with a badge, hiding behind authority to cover up their own insecurities. But you made a mistake coming after me and my family." Mill's hand shook slightly as he reached for his baton, his pride refusing to let him walk away. But before he could pull it free, Kai spoke up again, his voice steady but fierce. "Mum, let us handle it." Asha hesitated, glancing back at her son. She saw the determination in his eyes, the confidence in his stance. He wasn't a scared kid anymore. He was ready. "All right," she said quietly, "but remember what I taught you. Control. Precision. No mistakes." Kai nodded, stepping forward with Layla at his side. Mills sneered at the sight of the teenagers advancing toward him. "Oh, this is rich," he said mockingly. "What are you gonna do, kids? Fight me?" "You'll see," Kai replied calmly, his movements deliberate as he closed the distance. Mills swung his baton, aiming for Kai's side. But Kai ducked under the strike and grabbed his wrist, using a quick twist to disarm him. The baton fell to the ground, and before Mills could react, Layla stepped in, sweeping his legs out from under him with a well-timed kick. Mills hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Kai and Layla didn't give him a chance to recover. Working together with seamless coordination, they immobilized him, pinning his arms behind his back. Asha watched with pride as her children executed the techniques she had spent years teaching them. They weren't just defending themselves, they were doing it with control and precision, without letting their emotions take over. Mills struggled against them, his shouts of anger filling the air. "Get off me! You little brats, you're going to regret this." "Not as much as you will," Kai muttered, tightening his grip on Mills' arm. Layla stood over him, her voice calm but firm. "You need to stop resisting. You've already lost." The scene was a powerful one, a corrupt officer brought to his knees by two teenagers who had learned to stand up for themselves. But Asha knew this wasn't the end. Mills' backup could arrive at any moment, and they needed to be ready. "Kids," she said, stepping forward, "tie him up. We're not done here yet." As Kai and Layla worked to secure Mills, Asha turned her attention to the patrol car. She had a feeling that whatever was in those cache logs would explain everything. It was time to uncover the truth. The industrial lot was eerily quiet now, the air heavy with tension as Mills lay restrained on the ground, his face red with fury and humiliation. Asha stood tall, her eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of Mills' backup. Her instincts told her they didn't have much time before more officers arrived. Every move she made now had to count. "Mom," Kai said, his voice steady but urgent as he finished tying Mills' wrists with strips of nylon cord pulled from their training gear. "What do we do now?" Asha glanced at him, her calm exterior masking the rapid calculations running through her mind. She pointed toward the patrol car. "We find out why he's really here. That car holds answers." Layla, standing a few feet away, kept her gaze locked on Mills, her expression unreadable. "What about him?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the restrained officer. "He's not going anywhere," Asha replied firmly. Her voice softened as she addressed her daughter. "But stay alert. He's not the type to give up easily." Mills sneered, his lips curling into a cruel grin despite his position. "You think you've won?" He spat. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life. Backup's on the way, and when they get here, you'll all be in cuffs. Mark my words." Asha crouched beside him, her expression unflinching as she met his gaze. "Back up," she repeated, her tone icy. "And when they arrive, what do you think they'll find?" "A crooked cop lying in the dirt, tied up by a family defending themselves. Or maybe they'll find what's in that car of yours, cash, logs, and who knows what else. How much explaining do you think you'll have to do, Officer Mills?" For a moment, Mills' bravado faltered. His eyes flicked toward his car, then back to Asha. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled, but there was a hint of unease in his voice now. "Don't I?" Asha shot back, standing up and motioning for Kai and Layla to follow her toward the patrol car. "We'll see about that." As they approached the vehicle, Kai moved to the driver's side door, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He glanced at his mother, who nodded, giving him permission to open it. The door creaked as it swung open, and the faint smell of sweat and fast food wafted out. Inside, the dashboard was cluttered with papers, an empty coffee cup, and the bundle of cash logs they had spotted earlier. Asha leaned in, carefully lifting the logs and flipping through them. Her sharp eyes scanned the pages, her expression growing more focused with each entry she read. The documents were a detailed record of payments names, dates, and amounts. But these weren't fines or tickets. These were bribes, extorted from local business owners and residents. "This isn't just small-time corruption," Asha muttered, more to herself than to her children. "This is organized. Look at the names. He's been running a racket." Kai leaned in, his brow furrowing as he read over her shoulder. "Mom, these amounts, they're huge. And some of these people, I know them. Mr. Patel from the corner store. Miss S. Alvarez. She runs the bakery." Asha nodded grimly. "He's been bleeding the community dry. And it's not just him. Look at the initials next to the entries. He's working with others. This is a network. Layla's voice broke through their concentration, quiet but urgent. Mum, someone's coming. Asha's head snapped up. In the distance, she could hear the faint rumble of an engine growing louder. She quickly closed the logbook and handed it to Kai. Hide this. Now. Kai nodded, tucking the logbook into his backpack, which he had slung over his shoulder during their training session. Layla stepped closer to her mother, her eyes scanning the horizon. What do we do? She asked. Asha's mind worked quickly. They couldn't leave just yet. The evidence they had found was too important. But they also couldn't risk being caught off guard. She turned to her children, her voice firm but calm. Stay close to me. No sudden moves. Let me handle whoever this is. The rumble grew louder, and moments later, another patrol car rolled into view, its lights flashing but sirens off. Asha felt Layla's hand tighten on her arm, and she gave her daughter a reassuring squeeze. It's going to be okay, she said softly, though her attention never left the approaching vehicle. The car came to a stop, and a tall, broad-shouldered woman stepped out. Her uniform was crisp, her demeanor composed. Her nameplate read Sergeant Harris, and as she approached, her sharp eyes took in the scene: the restrained Mills on the ground, Asha and her children standing near the open patrol car. What's going on here? Harris demanded, her voice calm but authoritative. She directed her question at Asha, but her gaze lingered on Mills, who glared back at her with a mixture of desperation and anger. Asha stepped forward, her posture relaxed but commanding. Officer Mills attempted to detain us without cause, she said evenly. He escalated the situation, and we acted in self-defense. We've also found evidence in his car that suggests he's involved in illegal activity. Harris raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable as she looked between Asha and Mills. Is that so? She said slowly, turning her attention to Mills. Officer, care to explain? Mills sputtered, his face turning red. She's lying, he barked. They attacked me. That woman's teaching her kids to be criminals. They're dangerous. Harris's gaze hardened, and she took a step closer to Mills, crouching down so they were eye level. Dangerous, huh? She said coolly. You're tied up on the ground, and they're standing over there, calm as can be. Doesn't seem like they're the dangerous ones here. Asha watched carefully, assessing Harris's body language. There was something in the sergeant's demeanor, a sharpness, a sense of fairness that gave her a sliver of hope. We found this in his car, Asha said, motioning for Kai to step forward. He hesitated for a moment before handing the logbook to Harris. The sergeant flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing as she read. She let out a low whistle, shaking her head. Mills, she said, her tone cold, you've got a lot of explaining to do. It's not what it looks like. Mills protested, struggling against his restraints. This is a setup. They planted that. Harris ignored him, straightening up and turning back to Asha. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, she said. But I'm going to have to ask you and your kids to come with me to the station. We need to sort this out properly. Asha's jaw tightened. She didn't trust the system, not after everything they had just experienced. But Harris seemed different. There was a steadiness in her eyes that suggested she wasn't like Mills. All right, Asha said finally, nodding. But we're not leaving until Mills is secured. Harris gave a curt nod, pulling out her radio. Dispatch, I need backup at the old industrial lot. Officer involved in misconduct. Request immediate assistance. As Harris secured the scene, Asha turned to her children, her voice low. We're not out of this yet. Stay alert. No matter what happens, stick together. Kai and Layla nodded, their faces set with determination. They had trained for moments like this, but now it was real. and they knew the fight for justice was just beginning. The industrial lot buzzed with a tense, electrified energy. Sergeant Harris's request for backup had sparked a ripple effect neither Asher nor Mills fully anticipated. Asher stood near her children, her posture rigid but composed, watching as Harris finished securing Mills more effectively with proper handcuffs. The restrained officer spat curses and threats, but Harris silenced him with a sharp glare. "You've already said enough." "Mills," Harris snapped. "The more you talk, the worse this looks for you." Asher kept her focus split between Harris, Mills, and her children. She could sense Kai and Layla's nerves. Layla shifted her weight between her feet, while Kai clenched and unclenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. Asher leaned toward them and spoke in a low, calming tone. "Stick close to me. Don't react unless I tell you. Understand?" "Yes, Mom," they murmured, their voices subdued but resolute. Before anyone could say another word, the faint sound of approaching engines rumbled in the distance. Asher turned her head sharply toward the road leading to the lot, her instincts on high alert. Within moments, 2 more patrol cars rolled into view, their headlights cutting through the dim light of the waning day. Asher's stomach churned. This wasn't ordinary backup, this was something else. The cars came to a halt, and 4 officers stepped out, their movements deliberate, their faces unreadable. Asher immediately noticed that one of them, a tall, broad man with graying hair and a stiff gait, carried an air of authority. His badge read Lieutenant Garrison. He surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes before striding forward. "What the hell is going on here?" Garrison demanded, his voice gruff and impatient. His gaze flicked to Mills, lying restrained on the ground, then to Harris, who stood with the logbook in her hand. His expression hardened. "Sergeant Harris," he said, his tone sharp, "you called for backup, and now I find one of our officers tied up like a common criminal. Care to explain yourself?" Harris met his gaze evenly, her voice calm but firm. "Lieutenant, Officer Mills attempted to detain this woman and her children without cause. When I arrived, I found him escalating the situation unnecessarily, and I discovered this in his vehicle." She held up the logbook, her fingers tightening around it. "It's a record of bribes and extortion from local residents and businesses." Garrison's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He reached for the logbook, but Harris didn't let go immediately. Their eyes locked in a silent power struggle before she relented, releasing the evidence into his hands. As Garrison flipped through the pages, his lips pressed into a thin line. "And you believe this, what? Justifies assaulting an officer?" he asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. "No one assaulted him," Asher interjected, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "He was disarmed after he attempted to use unnecessary force on me and my children. Everything that happened here was in self-defense." Garrison turned his sharp gaze on Asher, sizing her up. "And who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Asher Wilson," she said firmly, stepping forward. "I'm a former Special Forces operative, and I know exactly what I'm talking about. Mills targeted us for no reason, escalated the situation, and then tried to detain us unlawfully. That logbook proves he has no business wearing a badge." Garrison's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Asher thought she saw something flicker across his face, recognition, maybe even unease. But the moment passed, and his expression hardened again. "Well, Ms. Wilson," he said coldly, "you've made some serious allegations. Unfortunately, this is not your call to make. I'll handle Mills, but you and your kids are coming with us for questioning." "No," Harris interrupted, stepping between Asher and Garrison. Her voice was steely, her stance unyielding. "That's not how this is going to work. Mills is the one under investigation here, not them. I called for backup to secure the scene, not to drag innocent civilians into custody. Garrison's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Sergeant, I'm not sure you understand how things work around here. This is my precinct, and I decide how we handle situations like this." Harris didn't back down. "With all due respect, sir, I'm following protocol. Mills was caught with evidence of serious misconduct. That logbook implicates not just him, but potentially others in this department. If you want to handle this by the book, then we need to start with him." The tension between the two officers was palpable, the air thick with unspoken power dynamics. Asher watched carefully, her instincts screaming that Garrison wasn't here to enforce justice, he was here to protect Mills and, by extension, himself. "You're stalling," Asher said suddenly, her voice cutting through the standoff. "I've seen this before. You're trying to control the narrative. Make this go away before it reaches anyone who can do something about it." Garrison's gaze snapped to her, his eyes cold. "Watch yourself, Ms. Wilson. You're already in over your head." "Am I?" Asher countered, stepping closer. "Because from where I'm standing, you're the one scrambling to cover your tracks. Mills isn't acting alone, is he? That logbook is proof that this goes deeper. How far up does it go, Lieutenant? How many people are you protecting?" For a moment, the lot fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Garrison's jaw clenched, and he took a deliberate step closer to Usher, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You're playing a dangerous game, lady. If I were you, I'd back off before you dig yourself into a hole you can't climb out of." Usher didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm not the one digging. You are. And when this all comes crashing down, you'll have no one to blame but yourself." Before Garrison could respond, one of the other officers stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice tense, "we've got company." Everyone turned to see a group of local residents gathering at the edge of the lot. Word had apparently spread about what was happening, and now a crowd was forming. They stood silently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and simmering anger. Asher recognized some of them faces she had seen at local stores, parents from the community. "What's going on here?" One man called out, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. "Why is she being detained?" Garrison's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to Usher. He looked like a man on the edge, his control over situations slipping with every passing moment. "We need to move this," he muttered to Harris, his voice low. "Get them out of here before this turns into a circus." "No," Harris said firmly, her voice rising so the crowd could hear. "We're not moving anything until this is handled properly. Mills is under investigation for corruption. These people deserve to know the truth." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tension escalating. Garrison glared at Harris, his frustration boiling over. "You're out of line, Sergeant." "And you're out of excuses," Harris shot back. She turned to the crowd, raising her voice. "This woman and her children are not criminals. They defended themselves against an officer who abused his authority. And now we have evidence that officer was involved in illegal activity." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Harris's words. Garrison's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized he was losing control. Usher stepped forward, addressing the crowd directly. "This isn't just about my family. This is about all of us. Mills and his accomplices have been extorting this community for years. We've all felt it, whether we knew it or not. Today it stops." The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of support, their collective energy surging. Garrison's face twisted with rage, but he knew there was nothing he could do now. The situation had spiraled beyond his control, and the truth was coming to light. Asher turned back to Harris, her voice calm but firm. "It's time to take this higher. Someone outside this precinct needs to see that logbook. Harris nodded. Agreed. Let's get this evidence where it belongs. As the crowd watched, Asha and her children stood tall, their presence a beacon of resistance against corruption. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning, and for the first time they weren't alone. The industrial lot was now a battleground, not one of fists or weapons, but of control, authority, and justice. The crowd of residents at the edge of the lot had grown, their murmurs swelling into demands for answers. Sergeant Harris stood firm beside Asha and her children, her hand gripping the incriminating logbook. Lieutenant Garrison, with his officers flanking him, radiated anger and desperation, knowing his control over the situation was slipping. "You're making a mistake, Harris," Garrison hissed, his voice low but venomous. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Harris shot back, holding her ground. "And it's about time someone did." Asha stood a step behind Harris, her eyes scanning the scene with precision. Every detail mattered now. The 2 patrol cars, the placement of the officers, the growing agitation in the crowd, everything was a potential tool or threat. Her children were silent beside her, their postures tense but ready. Asha knew this moment would determine everything, not just their safety, but whether justice would have a chance to prevail. The tension broke when one of Garrison's officers, a younger man with uncertain eyes, stepped forward. "Lieutenant," he said hesitantly, the crowd's getting restless. "Maybe we should." "Stand down, Carter." Garrison snapped, his voice cutting through the officer's sentence. "We're handling this my way." But Carter didn't move. His hesitation spoke volumes, and Asha seized the opportunity. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice clear and steady, "you know what's happening here isn't right. Mills has been extorting your community, your neighbors, your friends, and now your superior is trying to cover it up. Do you really want to be a part of this?" Carter's eyes flicked between Garrison and Asha, uncertainty clouding his face. Garrison stepped toward him, his expression furious. "Don't listen to her. She's trying to manipulate you." "No," Harris interjected, her tone sharp. "She's telling the truth. Mills isn't acting alone, and you know it, Carter. You've seen the signs. Are you going to keep looking the other way, or are you going to do what's right?" The crowd murmured louder, their frustration palpable. Carter's hand hovered near his radio, his internal conflict written all over his face. Finally, he stepped back, lowering his hand. "I'm not a part of this," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Not anymore." Garrison's face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, another voice rose from the crowd. "What's in that book?" a man shouted. "What are they hiding?" Harris raised the logbook high, her voice carrying over the commotion. "This is proof of corruption within this precinct. Extortion, bribes, and abuse of power. Mills is just the start, but he's not the only one involved." The crowd erupted, their voices a mix of anger and vindication. Garrison's remaining officers shifted uneasily, their confidence wavering as the weight of the moment pressed down on them. Asha stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Everyone here has felt the effects of this corruption," she said, her tone firm but resonant. "It's why your businesses struggle, why your neighborhoods are under constant scrutiny, and why justice feels so far out of reach. But this ends today." Garrison's desperation boiled over. He turned to his officers, barking orders. "Control the crowd. Get that logbook. Now." 2 officers hesitated but started moving toward Harris. Asha's body tensed, her instincts taking over. She stepped in front of Harris, her stance firm and unyielding. "You don't want to do this," Asha warned, her voice low and steady. "You know what's right, and it's not following his orders." The officers stopped, glancing at each other, uncertainty etched on their faces. Before they could act, Harris took a decisive step forward, holding up her radio. "I've already called Internal Affairs," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "They're on their way. If you obstruct justice now, you'll be going down with Mills and Garrison. Think carefully about your next move." The officers froze, their indecision plain. Garrison, however, was beyond reason. His face contorted with fury, and he lunged toward Harris, his hand reaching for the logbook. But he didn't make it. Asher moved faster than anyone could react. In one swift motion, she stepped in front of Harris, intercepting Garrison's advance. Her hands caught his wrist and shoulder, redirecting his momentum. With practiced precision, she twisted his arm behind his back and pushed him to his knees. "That's enough," Asher said coldly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a wave of support and defiance. Garrison struggled against her grip, but Asher held firm, her strength unwavering. Harris stepped forward, her hand on her radio. "Lieutenant Garrison," she said, her tone sharp, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit corruption. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Harris gestured to the hesitant officers. "Carter, secure him." Carter stepped forward, his movements shaky but resolute. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and clicked them onto Garrison's wrists. The lieutenant's shouts of protest were drowned out by the crowd's chants of justice. Justice! Kai and Layla exchanged a look, their faces a mixture of relief and pride. Their mother had stood firm, and now the tide was turning. Harris turned to Asher, her expression softening. "You've done more than most people would in your position," she said quietly. "But this isn't over yet. We need to get this logbook to Internal Affairs and make sure it doesn't disappear." Asher nodded. "Agreed. But we also need to make sure this community is protected. Garrison and Mills aren't the only threats here." Harris hesitated, then nodded. "I'll stay here and manage the scene. You and your kids should leave for now. Once Internal Affairs takes over, I'll make sure they get your statement." Asher glanced at the crowd, then back at Harris. "Thank you," she said simply. She turned to Kai and Layla, motioning for them to follow. "Let's go." As they made their way through the crowd, residents reached out to thank Asher, their voices filled with gratitude and hope. She nodded in response, her focus already shifting to the next step. This was far from over. As they reached the edge of the lot, Layla looked up at her mother, her voice quiet. "Do you think this will really change anything?" Asher paused, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It's a start," she said, "and sometimes that's all you need to spark something bigger." Kai nodded, his voice steady. "We'll be ready for whatever comes next." Asher looked at her children, pride and determination swelling in her chest. Together they walked into the twilight, leaving behind a fractured system, but carrying with them the seeds of change. The aftermath of the confrontation at the industrial lot sent shockwaves through the precinct and the community. In the days that followed, Internal Affairs descended on the precinct with a force that could not be ignored. The logbook, now in their possession, opened a Pandora's box of corruption, implicating not only Officer Mills and Lieutenant Garrison but several other officers who had been complicit in the extortion scheme. The community that had once lived in fear of its protectors now watched as those who had abused their power were held accountable. Asher sat at the kitchen table in her modest home, sipping a cup of tea as the evening news played on the television. The anchor's voice was somber but charged with the weight of unfolding justice. And in a stunning turn of events, Lieutenant Robert Garrison and several other officers from the 14th Precinct have been suspended, pending an extensive investigation into corruption and abuse of power. Officer Derek Mills, at the center of the allegations, faces charges of extortion, assault and misconduct. Community members have expressed relief and cautious optimism as these developments come to light. Asha's lips pressed into a thin line. It was a victory, yes, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The system that allowed people like Garrison and Mills to operate unchecked wouldn't change overnight. Still, it was a start. Kai and Layla entered the room, their energy buzzing with nervous excitement. They had spent the day fielding questions from classmates and neighbors who had seen the viral footage of the confrontation captured not by bystanders, but by the dashcam from Mills's own patrol car, which Sergeant Harris had ensured made it to the right hands. The footage had been a turning point, silencing skeptics and galvanizing the community. "Mom, everyone's talking about you," Layla said, sitting beside her mother. "They're calling you a hero." Kai leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "They should be calling you a badass." Asha chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone would do to protect their family." "But not everyone could do it like you did," Kai argued. His tone grew more serious. "You didn't just protect us. You fought back against something way bigger than us, Mom. That's not nothing." Asha set her cup down, her eyes softening as she looked at her children. "It's not nothing, but it's not enough either. Mills and Garrison are just symptoms of a much bigger problem. If we don't keep pushing, the system will find a way to cover this up and go back to business as usual." Layla frowned, her voice tinged with worry. "Do you think they'll try to come after us? For you know what we did?" Asha reached out, taking her daughter's hand in hers. "I won't let that happen," she said firmly. "We're not alone in this anymore. The community is waking up. People are watching. That's what they fear the most, losing control." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Asha stood, her body tense out of habit, but her expression softened when she saw who it was. Sergeant Harris stood on the doorstep, her uniform crisp but her demeanor relaxed. "Sergeant," Asha greeted, stepping aside to let her in. "What brings you here?" Harris held up a folder, her expression serious. "I wanted to update you personally. And call me Sarah. After everything we've been through, I think we're past formalities." Asha gestured toward the kitchen. "Come in. We were just talking about everything that's been happening." Harris entered, her presence filling the room with a quiet authority. She nodded to Kai and Layla, a faint smile crossing her lips. "You two did well out there. You should be proud." They both straightened, a spark of pride in their eyes. "Thanks," Kai said, "but it was all Mom." Harris turned back to Asha, her tone growing more serious. "Internal affairs is making progress. The evidence you helped uncover is leading to more arrests. It's bigger than we thought. There are connections to other precincts, even city officials. This could be the start of something massive." Asha nodded, her mind already racing. "And the community?" "They're rallying," Harris replied. "The investigation has given them hope, but they're looking to you. You've become a symbol, Asha. Whether you like it or not, people see you as someone who stood up when no one else could." Asha sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't set out to be a symbol. Symbols rarely do," Harris said. "But you've got a voice now, and people are listening. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" Asha's eyes flicked to her children, then back to Harris. She could see the weight of the sergeant's words, the opportunity that lay before her. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again," she said finally. "Not to my family, not to anyone, but I can't do it alone." "You don't have to," Harris said, her tone warm but firm. "The community is with you, and so am I. Whatever you decide, we'll make it happen." Over the next weeks, Asha's resolve turned into action. She began organizing self-defense workshops for the community, partnering with local organizations to provide free training and education. The workshops weren't just about physical defense, they were about empowerment, teaching people their rights and how to stand up against systemic injustice. Kai and Layla took active roles in the sessions, helping demonstrate techniques and sharing their own experiences. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a particularly well-attended class at a community center, a young woman approached Asha. Her face was shy but determined. "Miss Wilson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to thank you. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never felt like I had a voice. But watching you stand up to them, it gave me courage. I want to help." Asha smiled, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. "You don't need permission to help," she said. "Just start where you are, with what you have. That's how it begins." The woman nodded, her confidence growing. "I'll do that. Thank you." As the woman walked away, Kai and Layla joined Asha, their faces glowing with pride. "See?" Kai said. "You're making a difference." Asha looked at her children, the weight of the past weeks etched in their faces, but so too was a strength she hadn't seen before. "We're making a difference," she corrected, pulling them into a tight embrace. "This is just the beginning." In the final scene, Asha stands before a packed gymnasium, the buzz of conversation filling the air as people gather for another workshop. She takes the microphone, her voice steady but passionate. "We are stronger than the fear they try to instill in us," she says. "We are more powerful than the systems designed to keep us down. And together we are unstoppable. This fight isn't over, but we are ready for whatever comes next." The room erupts into applause, the sound echoing like a heartbeat of change. Asha steps back, letting Kai and Layla take the stage beside her, their presence a testament to the power of resilience and unity. As the screen fades to black, the message is clear: the fight for justice is never over, but the strength of a community, united and determined, can change the world.